Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
When my brother totaled my brand new car, he didn't even pretend to feel bad. Not for one damn second. He walked into my house with his stupid sideways grin, dangling my keys from his index finger like a child showing off a trophy he didn't earn. His jacket was half off his shoulder, sunglasses still in place even though it was dusk, and he just dropped the keys on my counter and said, "Relax, you'll get over it, Mom and Dad always make you." And he actually laughed, like this was all one big joke, like I hadn't just dropped 40 grand on that car less than 3 weeks ago, like I didn't have payments stretching into the next 5 years, and like I hadn't worked every single weekend for the last 10 months just to build the down payment without tanking my credit. That car was supposed to be my fresh start, but to him, it was just another toy to destroy. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't slap him or demand money or call our parents or do any of the things I might have done 10 years ago when I still believed someone would step in and say, "Zach, what the hell is wrong with you?" I just leaned back against the sink, crossed my arms, and looked at him. And when he saw that I wasn't reacting the way he expected, he got annoyed, not because he felt guilty, but because I wasn't playing my part in the usual family script where he F********* S up, and I forgive. The silence made him uncomfortable, so he doubled down. "You know it's not that bad," he said, already opening my fridge like he lived here. "Front end's busted, but it still drives. You probably overpaid anyway. That dealership smelled like a scam." He cracked open one of my drinks, the good ones I save for after brutal work weeks, and added, "You're always so dramatic." I told Mom it was an accident. She said, "You'll calm down like you always do." That right there, that sentence, was the moment something snapped. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a small click in the back of my mind. I realized then, not just intellectually but in my gut, that this wasn't going to change. That I could talk, argue, cry, beg, and nothing would shift in the way Zach existed in our family. He could destroy anything, people, property, opportunities, and someone would always rush in to brush the dust off his shoulders and remind him how special he was. How he didn't mean it. How he's trying his best. I pushed off the counter and walked to the drawer in the hallway desk where I'd tucked the folder. It was a plain black folder, nothing fancy, nothing labeled, but the contents inside were anything but simple. I'd been working on it for just over 3 weeks. Not because I expected this exact thing to happen, but because over the years, a person starts to collect certain patterns. You notice that the same people keep getting away with the same crimes. You keep records. You remember the lies. And eventually, you start putting things together. When I handed it to him, he took it with the same cocky nonchalance he used on everything in life, like he was holding something beneath him. He flipped it open with one hand while sipping my drink with the other. The first page didn't hit him. He skimmed it, half reading, then turned the page. By the third sheet, the smirk began to slip. By the sixth, he put the drink down. By the 10th, his entire posture changed. His mouth hung slightly open, the color drained from his face, and his eyes started scanning, fast and desperate, like someone searching for a fire exit in a building already burning. And still, I didn't say a word. See, this wasn't just about the car. The car was just the latest spark in a long, dry forest of resentment. It was about the time he stole $500 from my college fund and blamed a friend. About the way he trashed my apartment after a party and laughed while our parents told me I should have locked the liquor cabinet. About every Thanksgiving where he made snide comments about me being single, while they chuckled like he was some lovable scamp. About the way they told me to be the bigger person every single time he cut in line, took more than his share, lied straight to our faces, or pulled some other stunt that would have gotten me disowned if I'd even tried it. It was about the family dynamic where I was the stable one, so I didn't need help, while he was the troubled one, so he deserved endless forgiveness. It was about the invisible tally I'd been forced to keep my whole life. And now, finally, I'd cashed it in. He closed the folder halfway and said, voice lower now, "What is this?" But he already knew. Not the full depth, maybe, but enough to realize it wasn't just dirt, it was structure. Dates, receipts, screenshots, a trail of behavior that painted a very different picture of the man he liked to pretend he was. I smiled then, not a cruel smile, not triumphant, just calm. Like someone who finally put down a weight they'd carried for far too long. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, walking past him to pick up the keys he'd thrown carelessly on the counter. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to try to anchor me. "Elena. Seriously. What did you do?" That question hung in the air like a loaded gun, and I didn't answer. Not because I was being dramatic, but because he didn't deserve the comfort of knowing yet. He hadn't earned it. And in a strange way, neither had I, not the comfort of explaining myself to someone who'd never cared what any of it cost me. By the time he left that night, folder in hand, face pale, drink unfinished, he'd stopped talking. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He didn't call Mom. He just walked out, quieter than I'd seen him in years. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like losing. It felt like control. But here's a question for you, and I want you to be honest. If someone hurts you over and over again, if they betray you and laugh while doing it, and no one steps in to protect you, is it wrong to stop playing nice? Is it wrong to prepare for the day they push just a little too far? Because some people say revenge is petty. But I say it's just another word for balance. And believe me, things were about to get very balanced. It's funny how people always say the past is the past, like that phrase has any real power to erase things, like it somehow wipes clean the damage left behind by the people who never paid for it. But the truth is, the past doesn't go anywhere, it just sits under the surface like old rust beneath fresh paint, and all it takes is the right kind of pressure for it to rise again, sharp and angry and impossible to ignore. So when Zach laughed off totaling my car and tossed my pain aside with the same flippant arrogance he'd always used, it wasn't just about the smashed bumper, the bent frame, or the way my insurance was about to take a nosedive. No. It was about 20 years of knowing that whatever he broke, someone would sweep the pieces under my feet and tell me to step over them quietly, because he was still learning, because he was going through something, because I could handle it. I don't remember the first time I realized Zach was going to get away with everything forever. Maybe it was the day he borrowed our neighbor's bike and spray-painted it green to pretend it was his, then sobbed when he got caught until our mother told the neighbor's son he must have left it in the wrong yard. Maybe it was the weekend of my high school graduation when he skipped the ceremony to get drunk in the backyard and then told me, slurring, that I'd probably get fat in college anyway. I remember standing there in my cap and gown, holding my diploma in one hand and a plate of soggy cake in the other, while my parents told me not to make a scene and that he didn't mean it. Or maybe it was the night I got accepted into a summer internship that could have led straight into a job, something I worked for months to earn, and while I was on the phone with my mentor celebrating, Zach crashed my car into a street lamp driving it without asking. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't even sorry. He said he wanted to feel what it was like to drive something that didn't rattle when it hit 30. And even then, they didn't yell at him. They yelled at me. For leaving my keys on the kitchen hook. For not locking my glove box. For setting him up to fail, like his damage was something I had conjured just by existing next to him. It became a pattern so predictable, so quietly devastating, that it started to feel like background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator you only notice once it stops. Zach would lie, take, ruin, and instead of outrage or discipline, he would be met with phrases like, "Boys will be boys," or "He just doesn't think things through," or "He's your brother, Elena, you have to love him anyway." And I played my part, oh I did. I swallowed it. I adjusted. I became the good daughter, the responsible one, the caretaker, the fixer. I learned to clean up messes I didn't make, to apologize for things I didn't do, and to smile when they praised me for being so mature, while they handed him a second, third, 10th chance. By the time we were both in our 30s, it was less about favoritism and more about expectation. They didn't even ask me how I felt about things anymore. If he needed money, I should give it. If he crashed his car, I should loan mine. If he showed up drunk to Thanksgiving, I should be the one to get him a chair and fill his plate and cover his slurred insults with forced laughter so nobody would ruin the mood. I became, in their eyes, not a person with limits or feelings, but a buffer zone between his chaos and the world he never had to be accountable to. And yes, I distanced myself. I moved cities. I changed my number twice. But family has a way of pulling you back, sometimes through guilt, sometimes through obligation, and sometimes just through the worn-out hope that one day, someone might finally look at you and say, "You were right to be angry." But they never did. Instead, they called me too sensitive, even when I showed them evidence. Screenshots of texts where he threatened to pawn my laptop unless I wired him cash, photos of broken furniture, bruises from a door slammed too hard when I tried to block him from driving drunk. I wasn't hysterical. I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't vindictive. I was just done. And yet that wasn't enough to matter. It was always, "Come on, he's trying," or "Can you just let it go?" So no, when Zach crashed that brand new car of mine, the one I had saved for through every overtime shift, every sacrificed vacation, every morning I woke up at 5 to catch the train into the city for a job that barely acknowledged my name. When he wrecked it like it was nothing and told me to relax, I didn't feel angry. I felt clarity. Because I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe completely until that moment. They would never see me the way I needed them to. Not as someone who deserved justice or respect, not as someone with boundaries or value, but as the fallback plan. The one who could handle anything. The emotional garbage disposal for their golden child's wreckage. So when I started building the folder, the one I handed him the day of the crash, I wasn't thinking about revenge in the cinematic, explosive way we imagine it from TV. I wasn't plotting to destroy him. I wasn't even sure what I was going to do with it. What I knew was that I needed to stop pretending. I needed proof. I needed to see it all laid out in one place so that, even if nobody else ever took it seriously, I would never again gaslight myself into believing it hadn't happened. I wanted facts. Dates. Receipts. Every instance of abuse, every transfer, every voice memo he left at 3 in the morning blaming me for things I had no part in. I compiled it like a case file, not because I planned to go to court, but because I was tired of feeling like the crazy one. I needed to know that the pain had a pattern. That I wasn't weak for feeling tired. That he wasn't charming, he was cruel, and he had always been cruel, and I had just been trained to smile through it. And here's the thing they don't tell you about finally standing up to someone who's spent years trampling you. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like mourning. Because you don't just lose the person who hurt you. You lose every illusion you clung to about what love was supposed to look like. You lose the story you told yourself about how someday they'd change. You lose the comfort of denial. And for someone like me, who had built a whole identity around being fine, that loss was terrifying. But it was also the most honest I'd ever felt. I didn't know yet what I'd do with the folder. I hadn't made up my mind. But I knew that Zach had seen it, and that he knew I was no longer afraid of his tantrums, his charm, or the way our parents would inevitably call and say, "He didn't mean it." Because this time I meant it. And I was just getting started. The thing people rarely understand, especially the ones who've never had to survive in the shadow of someone else's chaos, is that silence doesn't always mean surrender, and calm doesn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes silence is strategy, and calm is the sound of a storm gathering strength behind your teeth, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. When I handed Zach that folder, the one I'd been quietly assembling in the late hours after work, when the world was finally quiet enough for my anger to become organized, I wasn't seeking confrontation, and I certainly wasn't doing it for show. I wasn't trying to humiliate him, or make him cry, or start some grand screaming match that would end with our parents choosing sides, because I already knew which side they would choose. I gave him that folder the way you serve someone a final notice, like placing a long overdue bill in their hand and saying, "You knew this day would come." He stood there in my kitchen, in the exact spot he had stood countless times before, sipping my drinks, borrowing my things, laughing at my boundaries like they were suggestions instead of needs, and for once, he looked like he was actually unsure of what to say. That alone was worth the months of late-night planning, the subtle collecting of evidence, the carefully worded emails and scanned documents and printed bank statements. each page representing one of the dozens of ways he had pushed past what was decent and expected me to absorb the fallout without complaint. Watching him flip through the first few pages, his confidence visibly cracking, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Not satisfaction, exactly, and not even revenge, but a strange, steady sense of vindication. Like I'd been screaming underwater for decades and had finally broken through the surface long enough to take a full breath. He didn't say much at first. His eyes scanned quickly, then slower, as the details began to register. The PayPal transfers from my parents' account to his gambling apps that he said were emergency rent money. The credit card debt he opened under my name back when I was 22 and too trusting to realize what he was doing. The text messages to his ex where he admitted he crashed my car years ago and let me take the blame to teach her humility. Page after page, he kept turning, the silence between us thickening like wet concrete, until eventually, he looked up and said, not with fear or apology, but with a kind of stunned disbelief, "You've been tracking me?" The question was laughable, not because it was wrong, but because it showed just how deeply he had come to believe that I was incapable of noticing what he did, like my role in the family was so firmly fixed in his mind that the idea of me paying attention, of me fighting back, felt unnatural. I didn't answer him directly, because there was nothing in that folder he hadn't done himself. I hadn't fabricated a single thing. I hadn't edited or twisted or manipulated. All I'd done was collect, document, organize. He had written the story. I had simply decided it was time someone read it from beginning to end. He tried to laugh, though it came out more like a cough, and said, "You're being dramatic, Elena. This is crazy." He flipped back through the pages as if hoping the tone would change if he read it again, like maybe there was some misprint or technicality he could point to, but all he found was a record of his own behavior laid bare in black and white, unembellished and damning. The moment he realized there were names on the last pages, names of people I had spoken to, places I had reported incidents, the HR manager who finally agreed to submit a formal complaint after Zach tried to use my company email for some pyramid scheme I still don't understand, the panic started to rise. His voice got higher, faster, more clipped. "You wouldn't actually show this to anyone," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a plea, right? I mean, you wouldn't screw up my life over, what? A car? A couple $1,000s. And I wish I could say I felt triumphant in that moment, that I felt powerful or righteous or even safe. But what I really felt, more than anything, was exhausted. Not tired in the way you feel after a long day, but the kind of weariness that seeps into your bones after years of being someone else's scapegoat, someone else's punching bag, someone else's safety net. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my brother. I saw a man who had been allowed, again and again, to choose cruelty over responsibility, because everyone around him had convinced themselves that he was too fragile, too emotional, too special to ever be held accountable. So I said nothing. I just picked up my phone, opened the email draft I'd had sitting in my outbox for 3 days, and let him watch me hover my thumb over the send button. His eyes widened, not with guilt, but with fear, the kind of fear you only feel when you finally understand that the person you thought you could manipulate forever has stopped caring about your excuses. He stepped forward, hand out like he was about to grab the phone, but I slipped it back into my pocket and said, calmly, "You should go." He didn't argue. Not loudly, anyway. He mumbled something I didn't catch, gathered the folder under his arm, and walked out without another word. I watched him leave from the front window, his pace slower than usual, his posture unsure. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not younger. Just diminished. Like a man who had finally seen the reflection he'd been avoiding for years and didn't quite recognize what stared back. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious or second-guessing, but because I was still waiting for the part of me that used to care to show back up. I waited for the guilt, the fear, the instinct to call my parents and explain everything before he twisted the story. But it never came. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where he had once spilled red wine and blamed my dog, where he had laughed about cheating on an ex and said she should have known better, and I realized that I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was simply done carrying the weight of keeping him safe from consequences he had spent a lifetime earning. I didn't know what he would do next. Whether he'd run to mom and dad, or try to spin a new story, or maybe even try to apologize. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, I wouldn't be standing in the way of it anymore. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about revenge at all. Sometimes it's just finally letting the truth walk out the door on its own, and choosing not to follow. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in when you've made a decision so permanent, so deeply rooted in years of buried resentment and slow-burning clarity, that there's no going back, no second-guessing, no apology that could bend the course of it anymore. It's not the dramatic kind of silence you see in movies, the one filled with trembling lips or tears caught in the corners of wide, glassy eyes. It's colder than that, quieter, heavier, like the air before a blizzard, where everything stills and you can feel the shift in your bones before the storm even touches the ground. That's what it felt like the morning after I handed Zach the folder and watched him walk out of my house without one real word of remorse, as though the thing unraveling between us was just another inconvenience he'd find a way to sidestep later. With charm or lies, or the kind of fake vulnerability he wore like a cologne when it suited him. But he didn't know the whole story. Not yet. Because the folder, thorough as it was only the tip of something far more deliberate. That was the evidence. The setup had started weeks earlier. It hadn't been some snap decision. I didn't just wake up one morning and decide I was going to destroy my brother's carefully manufactured image. That would have been far too simple and, frankly, not very effective. People like Zach don't break when you tell the truth outright. They bend it, twist it, dilute it until it's unrecognizable, until your pain becomes an exaggeration and their cruelty turns into some misunderstood joke that you're taking way too personally. I knew that if I was going to do this, it had to be done in a way that didn't just speak louder than his lies, it had to make them irrelevant. I wasn't trying to hurt him just for the sake of hurting him. I was trying to dismantle the house of cards he'd been living in for decades, one carefully calculated piece at a time. It started with the accounts. I'd always been careful with my finances, not just because of the job I had, but because I had learned the hard way that money was the first thing he'd target when he needed something and wanted to avoid accountability. I checked my credit reports regularly, set up alerts on all my cards, kept my passwords changed and written down nowhere but a notebook I kept in my safe. But the more I looked into his history, the sudden influxes of money, the mystery job offers that never quite materialized, the loans he never repaid to family members who were too embarrassed to admit they'd been duped, the more I realized just how much he relied on people's willingness to look the other way. So I started documenting it. Not just the transactions, but the patterns. I requested copies of old bank statements from our parents' joint accounts, ones they sometimes linked to cover family expenses, and highlighted every recurring name, every withdrawal that lined up with one of his supposed emergencies. I reached out, quietly, to an old college roommate of his who had once drunkenly mentioned to me that Zach had used his social to apply for a credit card. That man, now married with kids and still dealing with debt collectors for a card he never opened, was surprisingly eager to talk. He sent me what he had: emails, a scan of the credit application, even a text from Zach saying, "Just don't freak out, it's handled." Then came the professional side of things. Zach had always boasted about his work: consulting, app development, freelance marketing, whatever was trendy enough to sound impressive, but vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. But the more I looked, the more I found that his supposed clients didn't exist, or weren't clients at all but friends who'd let him use their names for legitimacy. I contacted one of them, a woman named Beth who ran a small design firm, and when I asked about Zach's involvement, she went quiet before admitting that he'd charged $5,000 on her company card for a branding package he never delivered. When she confronted him, he spun a sob story about being in a mental health crisis, and she let it go. "He's really good at making you feel like you'll make things worse if you push," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of guilt and hindsight. She gave me the invoices, the emails, all of it. And then there was the legal piece. This part was trickier, slower, but I had time and I had patience, and more importantly, I had nothing left to lose when it came to the myth of Zach being redeemable. I reached out to a lawyer friend of mine, not to sue, not yet, but to understand my options. Could I report the identity theft from a decade ago even if I hadn't pursued it then? Could I submit a formal complaint about the way he used my address for fraudulent mail? Could I warn others without exposing myself to liability? She walked me through it all. And with every answer she gave me, another weight lifted off my chest. Because it turned out I wasn't crazy or petty or vindictive. I was just someone finally doing what should have been done a long time ago, holding him accountable. By the time I finished compiling everything, the folder was just one of several, each labeled, dated, backed up to a hard drive and a private cloud account. The physical folder I gave him was only enough to shake him. The real setup, the one he couldn't escape by sweet-talking our mother or crying to our father or pretending to be the poor misunderstood victim, was already in motion. And still, through all of it, I hadn't told anyone. Not my parents, who would have called me ungrateful. Not mutual friends, who would have accused me of trying to ruin him. Not even Marcy, my best friend, who had always seen through his act but never understood how deeply he had carved himself into every failed corner of my life. I stayed quiet because I knew the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand still long enough for the lies to run out of breath. What I didn't expect, what caught me off guard, was how he would respond. Not with rage, not right away, but with a kind of quiet desperation. A voicemail the next night, at 2 a.m, slurred and confused. Lena, I don't know what you want. You're my sister. We're family. Can't we fix this? No apology. No ownership. Just panic, thinly disguised as reconciliation. He knew something was coming, and he couldn't stop it, because for once, I hadn't told him what I was doing. For once, I didn't clean up the mess. And I didn't respond. Because the setup was never about warning him. It was about building something solid beneath me, something that couldn't be undone by charm or crocodile tears. It was about proving to myself that the quiet girl he'd walked all over was not only paying attention, but was always one step ahead. There comes a point, somewhere in the slow unraveling of a long-held family myth, when the truth finally pulls itself out from under years of denial, manipulation, and careful rephrasing, and steps fully into the light. Not as a dramatic explosion or a single unforgivable moment, but as a quiet, irrefutable shift in the way things are, one that changes the dynamic not with fire, but with finality. And when that moment came in our family, when the pieces of my long, calculated decision began to fall where they were always meant to fall, there wasn't shouting, not at first. And no one slammed a door or threw a plate across a kitchen or cursed me out with the kind of venom they save for outsiders. It started, instead, with a phone call from my mother, her voice tightly wound in that tone she only uses when she's trying to act calm, but is so clearly brimming with panic that it comes off less like concern and more like blame that hasn't fully ripened. She opened with pleasantries, of course, as though it were a casual Sunday check-in, and not the beginning of the collapse of everything they'd built around pretending Zach was someone he had never been. "Hi, honey," she said, like she hadn't already spoken to him, like she didn't know I had crossed a line that I wasn't planning to uncross. "We just heard from your brother. He said there's been some kind of misunderstanding." A misunderstanding, that was her word. Not betrayal, not theft, not fraud. Not even mistake. Just a gentle, vague, family-friendly term, sanitized and polite, designed to avoid saying the part that had been true all along. Zach had never been a victim of his circumstances. He had simply been allowed to operate without consequences because those around him found it easier to excuse him than to confront what he truly was. I didn't respond the way she wanted. I didn't rush in with reassurances or pretend there was some miscommunication to smooth over. I simply said, evenly, "He saw the folder. I didn't send it to you yet, but I can. It's all real." And there was a long, aching pause on the other end of the line, as if she couldn't believe I would speak such a sentence aloud, as though I had violated some unspoken contract that we had never officially signed, but had been expected to follow all the same. The one where I absorbed everything, stayed quiet, and kept the illusion of peace intact no matter how much it cost me. When she spoke again, her voice cracked not with grief, but with anger that she tried to pass off as sadness. Why would you do this to him? To us? Elena, you know he's struggling. You've always been the strong one. And there it was, the lifelong refrain, the script written into my bones. You're the strong one. You're the one who can take the hit, clean up the mess, swallow your pride, and get back to work without needing anyone to hold your hand or carry your weight. It was never about fairness, it was about convenience. About how much easier it was for them to lean on the responsible child while offering endless compassion to the reckless one. I didn't yell. I didn't try to make her see. Because I had finally understood that there's no volume loud enough to make someone hear what they've spent their entire life refusing to listen to. Instead, I sent the folder to her email, along with a second one that contained things she didn't know, or maybe did know but never let herself admit. Screenshots of Zach using her credit card to buy gift cards he later resold for cash. Voicemails from his exes. Police reports she never saw because he told them not to call the house. And I ended the message with a single line, "You asked what I did to him." I kept receipts. That's all. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. The next time Zach showed up in my life, it wasn't in person or over the phone, it was through a social media message from one of his old friends, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, who simply wrote, "Is it true?" I didn't reply, because by then, the damage had already begun to ripple outward. It wasn't about public shame. I hadn't posted anything, hadn't gone viral, hadn't called a press conference. The truth was doing its own work, the way it always eventually does, slow but steady, reshaping the story from the inside out. But the fallout wasn't just his. That's the part no one warns you about. When you finally tell the truth in a family that's built on pretending, you don't just lose the liar. You lose everyone who needed the lie to make sense of themselves. I stopped getting invited to family dinners. Holiday texts went unanswered. My father called once, weeks later, his voice hollow and hesitant, and said, "I don't understand why you couldn't just talk to us." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfect snapshot of the very problem I had tried, for years, to articulate. I had talked to them. They just hadn't been listening. So I stopped talking. I took some time off work. I changed the locks. I closed the joint safety deposit box our parents had opened years ago, just in case, the one only Zach and I had keys to, because I didn't want to leave even a sliver of vulnerability open anymore. I started therapy again. Not because I was unraveling, but because I finally had the space to heal without having to explain why it hurt in the first place. And here's the thing people never really want to admit. Sometimes closure isn't soft. It's not a warm reconciliation or a heartfelt apology or a family reunion where everyone cries and promises to do better. Sometimes closure is simply walking away with your evidence in order and your dignity intact, while the people who once depended on your silence choke on the weight of their own complicity. I haven't spoken to Zach since that day in my kitchen, and I don't expect to. Maybe he's rebuilding somewhere, spinning a new version of himself to people who haven't yet seen the real one. Maybe he's angry. Maybe he's planning some story where I'm the villain, the ungrateful sister, the one who ruined everything just because she couldn't let the past go. That's fine. Let him tell it. Let them all tell whatever stories they need to sleep at night. I'm not here to argue anymore. Because in the end, I didn't burn anything down. I didn't expose him to hurt him. I didn't take revenge in some bitter, theatrical way. I simply stopped hiding the truth. And in doing that, I finally stopped hiding myself. But here's the question I still carry with me, and maybe you will too. If no one protects you, not even the people who should have loved you best, is it really so wrong to finally protect yourself, even if it breaks the whole damn family in the process? I don't know the answer. And maybe that's the point.